Welcome to Life Unrestricted.
This is your show if you're sick of living a life controlled by food and exercise rules, and if you're ready to learn how to accept yourself and enjoy the heck out of life. My gig is about body image, femininity, self-worth, and resilience. Come on, let's walk side by side as we slowly step out of restriction misery and unlock our true selves.
Your host, Merritt Boxler, is a former national radio DJ, freelance journalist, speaker, and writer with a passion to make women feel good in their bodies. This is a show brought to you live from Switzerland.
Hey, lovely radicals. Welcome back. How are you? You know what I've been thinking about lately? I was thinking that probably for someone on the outside of the body positive movement, it could be easy to judge this whole thing as a ridiculous and probably even superfluous pursuit. But when you really think about it, it's not just not ridiculous or superfluous, but it is in reality even more important than we on the inside might think. Advocating for body positivity and fighting against this old paradigm that causes us to think that our bodies are a problem, this whole thing is about equality. It's about respect. It's about inclusivity. And it's about freeing resources that have been trapped in this never-ending body-obsessing cycle that plays into the hands of the billion-dollar diet and beauty industries out there. Imagine how much brain power we could free up if we let our bodies be what they are, if we could just appreciate them for what they do for us every day, when all we've been taught to do is hate on them, scrutinize them, manipulate them, when what they really are vessels that give us the opportunity to experience the world. Then we would take care of them naturally, normally, without obsessing, without dieting, without over-exercising, simply because we appreciate them. If we didn't obsess about who looks how and who eats what, we could finally invest our mental energy, our physical energy, and our money into stuff that should actually be top priority in everyone's mind at this point of human existence. By that I mean investing in renewable energies, ending wars, injustice, inequality, and oppression, invest in education, in birth control, in healthcare, in sustainable economic structures. It's worth letting that sink in. Because we often get stuck in our little headspace where all we think about is ourselves really and how the world might perceive us and if we are loving our bodies yet. But when we let it sink in, we realize that body positivity is not about size. It's not about loving your body every day of your life, but it's about just being more neutral about it. Not caring about looks and size as much anymore, and investing in the actual life, our values, our passion, appreciating being alive. How about that? Because weight loss is not an achievement. It's not something worth living for, worth wasting all your time for. Who wants their tombstone to say, she was an excellent dieter, she obsessed over eating clean and staying thin until the day she died, but she never really lived. Honestly, this whole movement is about much more than our personal feeling towards our reflection in the mirror. It's about realizing that this reflection shouldn't hold any power over us whatsoever, really, because our bodies will change. They age. We might run into some health issues, we might have accidents, scars, marks, and still, we are alive as long as we are alive. And no matter how religiously people obsess over their choice of food, They will not be safe from loss. They will not be safe from disease. They will not be safe from death. Sorry to break it to you like that, but it's an inconvenient fact of life. Everything else is magical thinking. Just because someone found healing in something doesn't mean it is for everybody. Some say praying made them healthy. Some say it was writing and burning poems written in blood around the full moon. Some say it was drinking their urine. Some say it was massaging their thumb at 11:20 in the morning. I mean, really, what are we believing? We do not know what is true and what's not. We cannot know what causes what. We do not know what is coincidence and what is not. And we shouldn't just buy into every miracle story someone has sold to a publisher for a shit ton of money. Really, all we need is an awake mind and a brain that works. And radicals, your brains do work. And then we'll know that we best listen to our own bodies, that we know what's best for us, and that no celebrity or no just random person who has sold 1 million books can tell us how we should live our lives. Then we recognize and realize that our existence is really about everything but our outside appearance, right? I mean, think about it. What do you remember people for? I remember people for their love, their patience, creativity comes to mind, also their passion, their smiling eyes, their wicked humor, or their drive to better the world. Not for their bellies, not for their caloric intake, not for their level of fitness. So let's step out of this prison diet culture has built for us. And let's face that we have all sat in a cell that we are the guard of. We can set ourselves free. No one else can. And we can only set ourselves free if we start questioning the lies about having to earn worthiness in life. That I can tell you simply by looking at an apple tree. It is worthy because it is there. And no one cares if it has a few missing branches, if it's a bit taller or smaller, if its trunk is wider than the trunk of its neighbor, or if its twigs are shaped in a certain way. We appreciate it for being there, for bringing us its apples, not for looking good as an object. That's what I tell my inner gremlin every day. And of course, he still doesn't shut up. But neither will I, and neither should you, because you are worthy exactly as you are, simply because you are here. And by the way, thank you to all of you who have written such heartwarming reviews on iTunes. I'm very grateful for all this kindness. And I bet people who would maybe not have listened in without reading your review, they are even more grateful for you taking the time to write this review. So thank you. You're really offering a service to the world if you write a review. And it's not about me, but it's about someone else, maybe stopping and paying attention and listening in. So thank you, dear ones. You really are the best people to have around. And for those of you who want to support this show financially, please look at my site on the support platform patreon.com. You can find my site at patreon.com/lifeunrestricted. So that's patreon/lifeunrestricted. And who knows, maybe you feel like supporting this mission. It would help me immensely to keep this work up because it is extremely cost and time consuming to produce. But don't get me wrong, I love doing this for you and I will keep doing this for you for as long as I can. I'm just saying I'm grateful for support. Thanks for all of you, for all the love that you're bringing to me and to the world. So how about another great show? In today's episode of the Life Unrestricted podcast, I talked to Isabel Foxen Duke from San Francisco. She's a certified health coach and emotional eating expert. Isabel is the founder of the renowned Stop Fighting Food program that has helped countless women making peace with food, with their body, so that they can stop obsessing about food and get back to enjoying their lives again. After years of trying to overcome her binge eating through quote-unquote traditional and alternative approaches, Isabel has managed to heal herself. And she discovered how binge eating and dieting are linked. She's incredibly successful in her work and has helped thousands of women overcome their food issues for good. And when we started talking, I opened up to her by telling her that we have a pretty sad fact in common, namely that we were put on diets for the first time before we were even 5 years old. And after that, I asked her to take us back to her earliest memories of being in a body.
Wow, that is an interesting question. A slightly different take on what I'm usually asked when, people often will say, what's your story? But this is a little bit more specific, isn't it? So my earliest memories of being in a body, I think that I will not be alone in this one, but I absolutely have memories of comparing the circumference of my thighs to other girls in dance class.
At what age?
I'm so young that I don't really even know what specific age I was, but I would imagine going back to probably 4 or 5.
Yeah.
I remember, I was super young. Like I was definitely, at that point where it wasn't even real, like ballet class. It was just sort of like, you're just doing pliés basically. But I remember, taking ballet class when I was super, super young. I did a little of everything at that age. And I remember comparing my thighs with other dancers in dance class. I also was a gymnast sort of later in my life. So between the ages of like probably 7, 8, 9, 10, I was really focused on gymnastics. And I remember also similarly being confident about what my body could do. I was really good at gymnastics, but I also have this memory of my doctor telling me that she'd never seen quadriceps like mine before, like she'd on a child. Just little things like that. Like I just knew that there was something about me, about my body parts that I perceived to be larger than other girls. And that was just something that I was very conscious of, basically from the moment that I can remember.
Yeah, I can so relate. I was so small, maybe kindergarten or in school, and I was at the Girl Scouts for the little girls. I don't know how they are called in English. Those little Girl Scouts. And I remember, when we went away for a weekend or so and everybody got undressed and put their PJs on in the evening, I would look at them and go, I want to be like them. And I felt really bad, really ugly. And I was bullied all the time also. And
oh, really?
Yeah. I don't know if that happened to you too, or was it just your home environment that kind of turned you on to the concept of something being wrong with your body?
It was my home environment, and my pediatrician was also very much, that was a big topic of conversation every time I went to have my annual physical. I mean, the most terrifying moment of every year was getting on the scale of the doctor's office from a very, very young age on. But, I kind of describe my body shape as like medium-sized, right? So I remember having, of my group of girlfriends being just like more muscular, just bigger, more athletic. But I also had some level of thin privilege most of my life. And I'm very aware of that, right? Because I also remember there were girls in the class who were actively made fun of for their weight. I remember 1 or 2 in particular where it was like, oh, like they were the girls who were called fat. And it was like, there was this distinction, it's like, I always think about weight stigma as something that happens on this spectrum basis. It's like, I've always sort of lived somewhat in a medium-sized woman's body, but as a medium-sized woman, I also just very much did not feel good enough and just felt like, the thing keeping me from effectively being a Disney princess and having all of the privileges and like unicorns and rainbows popping out of the sky is me not being like slightly even more thinner. But I definitely had enough thin privilege that I wasn't being actively bullied in school. I was mainly just comparing myself in social circumstances. But, I see weight stigma as this sort of thing that happens on a spectrum, spectrum all the way from, I'm the straight size model on one end to what activists would refer to as like super fats. And weight stigma happens all along the spectrum. And depending on where they are on that spectrum, they're going to have different experiences. So a medium-sized woman is going to have a different experience than a very thin woman versus a fat woman versus super fat, et cetera, et cetera.
Exactly. And going back to school, I remember the sad thing about this weight stigmatizing being that I was about maybe 7, 8, 9, and there was a girl and a boy who were bigger than I was. And in order for me to get bullied less, I participated in the bullying of them.
Yeah.
I remember that I was just basically trying to stay safe. But in order to do that, I did the whole thing to them. And now that I see all the connections to that, I really wonder what happened to them. Maybe they had eating disorders just as I did as well. Maybe they are still obsessed about their bodies or their weight. I don't know. But I am conscious of the fact that I contributed to that just in order to deflect the hate coming at me directly.
Right. And it's so interesting because, it makes sense in the brain of an 8-year-old, right? Or a 7-year-old or whatever. But one thing that I often really try to encourage my thin clients to understand is that discrimination against fat people ultimately is really part of the same problem that, without weight discrimination, without fat discrimination, if that didn't exist, if that problem didn't exist, ultimately a lot of disordered eating amongst thin people wouldn't exist either, right? Like I really try to help thin people understand, thin people who are struggling with disorder or dysfunctional eating, to understand that weight discrimination, fat discrimination specifically, just is an issue that ultimately touches the lives of every single woman and man, irrespective of where you fall on the spectrum. Like you either are fearing becoming fatter, you're either desiring more thinness for more social status, which I think is a lot of thin women's experience, right? They just want to get to that next level. They want to, sort of climb the ranks of thinness to try and, and I don't think these are necessarily even conscious thoughts, but it's like, everyone will love me. I can get the better, richer boyfriend or get a boyfriend at all, or whatever the thing is, whatever the social prize that they think is going to come at the end of thinness. At some point, and I don't even remember when this happened, but I was definitely sold the Disney industrial complex. That's what I call it, the Hollywood dream of romance. And I was definitely taught that my femininity needed to be validated by my abilities, in quotes, to, get a man. And I was even conscious of this as a little girl. Like I wanted the boys to think I was pretty.
Yeah, me too. Totally.
I wanted to be the girl that all the boys thought was pretty and cute and they had a crush on. And so that was sort of, my body image stuff was heavily, from an inappropriately young age on, was very much wrapped into being validated by the opposite sex. So that was sort of my body image experience. And I remember having explicit memories being in 5th grade. So I was 10 years old. I was comparing myself to my best friend at the time who was thinner. And, she was dating the guy who was like the most popular guy in school. And I was dating his like slightly less popular friend. I mean, this all sounds so awful and so crass, but this was how I interpreted it in my crazy head at the time, And so in my mind, I was thinking, I was like, oh, like if I just was a little bit thinner, then I would gain, this like the social prize, right? The social prize seemed to be about boys, basically from the time I was 10 years old onwards. And again, I don't think that that's everyone's experience. Absolutely not. But that was certainly a big part of my story because, again, that was the brand of femininity that was sold to me when I was young. And everyone has different brands of femininity that are sold to them and different gender-related issues that are sold to them. And I think that they affect our relationship with weight in different ways. Certainly not everyone's experience will be about, pleasing the opposite sex. However, that was definitely a big part of my story. And so, ultimately it's just like the more desperate you are to want to be thinner and the more heavily you sort of cling to these, whatever social prizes, you associate with thinness. It's like in my mind, the perfect life was a diet away, was one successful diet away. And that was pretty much my experience my whole life until I ended up going to rehab. I never didn't operate that way. The perfect life, the perfect guy, the perfect this, even just the better this, the better guy, the better situation, the better life was always just one successful diet away. And if I could just stick to it this time, I would get whatever social prize I was going after at that point.
So you were actively dieting or already eating disordered when you were like in puberty?
Oh, yeah. I remember actively throwing up my food in 5th grade. That was the first time.
5th grade already? Okay.
Yeah. That was the first time I ever purged. I have a very distinct memory of it. I figured out how to do it in 5th grade, and I think everyone who, unfortunately, if anyone has an experience of purging, it's a really dark, traumatic thing. But I think most of the people I know who have a history of purging, they can have a memory of sort of like when they figured that out, right? It sort of almost felt like a trick. It did scare me enough that, I remember, kind of being aware enough that I should not do it very often. Right. Okay. And I was scared of being an eating disordered person to some extent. Mm-hmm. Even though I was, irrespective of my purging, it's pretty obvious that I was an eating disordered person, right? I mean, purging is just one thing that I was doing. I was clearly engaging and totally screwed up in my mind. I was clearly struggling violently. But there was definitely this feeling of like, oh, no, that's now you're crossing the line. You got to be careful or conscious about that. But it definitely still happened, periodically throughout my life, which is something I don't often talk about even in interviews, because there were also periods in my life where I didn't purge at all and I was still wildly crazy and sick in my head.
Yeah.
It was always diet binging for me. I was never successfully anorexic, in quotes, successful, right? I was talking to a mentor of mine and she said, binging is actually, like, you could argue, like a really great thing. It's like that part of you that wants to not die of starvation is just screaming, and you're, to some extent, you're like allowing that to happen, right? Mm-hmm. So it's a sign of health that we actually go to food after a period of restriction, starvation, right? That's actually how I think about binging. It's like a natural reaction. It's a reaction to restriction as a reaction to starvation. That is ultimately what keeps you alive at the threat of starvation, right? You can start to look at it and it's almost like the binging is not really the problem. I mean, it's painful and it's awful and it's shame-filled and it's so hard to experience when you are in it, right? Because in the mind of this is sort of the person who's diet binge cycling, that's the failure. However, coming out of it years later, my new perspective on it is sort of like, oh, wow, I get it. Binging was actually what was keeping me alive. That was actually me getting the calories I needed when I was violently trying to control my size and starve myself.
Yeah, totally. I mean, I really like this idea because it was always just making me more desperate, because I thought that I was, as you said, not even successful at not eating. And there was only a short period of time when I got really, really skinny, but that was because when I was 20, I had diet pills for the first time from my doctor, but they were taken from the market, so I couldn't take that anymore, and I regained the weight. But much later, I got Ritalin, basically speed for ADHD, and then I got hooked on that, because it made me lose weight really fast. And I was like, it doesn't help me for ADHD, but I don't care. I will take this for the rest of my life. I have to, because this finally makes me skinny. And I really, I had a long time to figure out, I am actually poisoning myself. And do I want this really? So I gave it up and regained the weight. But I see now how much, my liver suffered. And I went in overdrive for 2 or 3 years. I was basically running like in the first gear on the highway. You know what I mean? Like, all the time.
I do. Yeah, the brief period where I was, quote unquote, able to control my weight was a complete facade, because I was just cheating. I was pretty much addicted to cocaine. And that was never going to be a long-term solution. I mean, ultimately I lost a lot of weight really fast, and I quickly got kicked out of college because my life fell apart. I mean, drugs will do that to you. It's like, sure, you can get thin being a drug addict. Do you want to be a drug addict?
So sad. Yeah, I know.
So that was actually, though, when I got into clinical rehab, and I tell this story, I wonder if I'd ever have been treated. I wonder if my course of treatment, for this entire issue would have ever even happened had I not gotten to that point. I was taken seriously as a sick person, because of my drug use.
Yeah. I relate so much because I had the exact same experience. For never ever in those 20 years did anyone take me seriously as to how much I was suffering, and I was probably showing anorexic tendencies inside, but I was not thin, very thin. And then when I got this Ritalin and the weight dropped in no time, then everybody became, concerned. And my doctor started weighing me, the same person who gave me diet pills 20 years before. Right. And, they started to become aware of there might be a problem, but it took...
It took that. That was my experience, is that, and that's one of the things that I'm really sort of very much advocate for and trying to fight for, is that, people think that in order for you to have a food problem, you need to be thin, or on the spectrum, people think if you're fat, you also could have a food problem, right? Like, it's like, you need to be like, there's something wrong with you if you're too fat. There's something wrong with you if you're too thin. But really, disordered eating can happen all along the weight spectrum. There is no weight at which somebody is just like definitively eating disordered or struggling with food or whatever. I think there are plenty of medium-sized women in the world who are unfortunately struggling, and it's a shame because they are oftentimes, I think, the people who are least likely to get the help they need because no one's actually paying attention. No, basically.
And people in bigger bodies even get the advice to lose weight when they've been struggling all the time, and it just exacerbates all the problems.
Right. And that's the flip side of the situation, is that, when people are worried about fat people, they're usually just spurring on disordered eating. They're not actually healing anything. Yeah. So yes, basically you're screwed no matter what. I mean, there's just such poor information about this issue out there. And, there's so many misconceptions. I very much identified as a binge eater for most of my life. I was like, I'm a binge eater. That's my problem. I binge eat. I can't control myself around food. My problem is that I can't stick to my diet. Mm-hmm. And, that was, I think, for a very, very long time why I never actually, quote unquote, got better, because I didn't realize that actually at the root of any, quote, binge eating problem is a restriction problem. It took me a long time to understand that. It took me a long time to want to admit that, because I didn't want to give up on dieting, right? Like, I thought once I succeeded on the diet, unicorns and rainbows would pop out of the sky. I'd have no problems. Everyone would love me. So I didn't want to give that up, and I just kept going to therapists being like, just teach me how to not binge. Just teach me how to not binge. Just not teach me how to not binge. Yeah. And I was either not told or I wasn't willing to hear that at the bottom of any binge eating is some sort of diet mentality, period. Yeah. Right.
You experienced eating disorder treatment twice, if I remember this correctly.
I was in 2 inpatient facilities.
Yeah. In what way were they helpful or not helpful?
My general spiel about clinical treatment is that there are some very cool, rad clinical therapists who get the joke and understand the sort of deep socio-cultural issues involved here and do their best to try to educate their patients, clients around those issues. But it is a big challenge. And ultimately, the reason for this is that clinicians, therapists, and nutritionists, right, they are part of the traditional medical model, right? And they are held to standards that tie them to the traditional medical model. And at the moment, our traditional medical model in the Western world, right, like the general understanding of weight is inherently weight biased. Mm-hmm. So basically what you have is a situation where the professionals treating eating disorder patients are working within a weight stigmatized framework. And as long as that's the case, you are not going to have high recovery rates for eating disorders. Like you are going to have abysmally low recovery rates for eating disorders, right? It's like effectively, it's like, I'm trying to think of an example, but it's like essentially you're going to get treatment for something in a place where they are connected to the problem, right? And again, I think that there are great therapists and great, nutritionists and clinicians out there who get this, but it's really, really hard. I mean, you're in a system, right? As a clinician, you are in a system. You've been trained your whole life in a system that basically has taught you the opposite of what is actually going to help your patients.
I even know about a woman who went to a treatment facility for her binging problem, as she described it. And then the first thing apparently that happened to her was she was put on a restrictive calorie controlled meal plan. Yeah. And then she was in there for 2 months and she had her eating in control, quote, and then she came out and she immediately regained the weight. Yeah, and of course. She blamed herself, as we do.
Yeah, totally. I was put on a meal plan both of the times that I was in inpatient rehab. I think it's interesting because for inpatient rehab specifically, the goal is basically just crisis intervention at that point, is my understanding, right? At that point, they're just trying to keep you alive, particularly for those patients who are quote unquote clinically underweight, meaning under a certain BMI. They're basically just trying to get you fed enough that you can healthfully function. There's not a ton of healing, especially it's like you go into inpatient rehab usually for not that long a period of time. It's like there's only so much actual psychological healing that can happen. And on top of it, you're not usually getting really strong sociological education, which in my opinion is really sort of the crux of the problem when it comes to clinical treatment, whether it be inpatient or whether it be, I'm just going to see this therapist. At its core, yes, this is a therapeutic and psychological issue, but it is a socio-psychological issue, right? It is a psychological issue that intersects with oppression. The psychological issue would not be triggered if there wasn't already a form of oppression that basically said your life will be better if you're thin, right? It's really easy if you're a woman, right? And you're dealing with just human problems, right? You're dealing with, relationship stuff, emotional stuff. We all seek out coping mechanisms. We're all trying to avoid pain and seek pleasure. We're all doing that in our lives. Those of us who have propensity for underlying anxiety, depression, quote unquote comorbidities, we're going to even be potentially more likely to seek out those things. So there's obviously this connection between sort of underlying comorbidities and sort of a greater compulsivity towards dieting, right? But at the end of the day, the compulsivity would take a different shape and form if weight stigma didn't exist, right? Like in order for that particular compulsivity to exist, that particular, and I'm talking about dieting right now, right? Like in order for that desire for thinness to exist, there needs to be a social cultural trigger, right? I have debates about this with people all the time because people always say, oh, but if you're dealing with underlying issues like anxiety, depression, obviously you're so much more likely to be engaging with disordered eating and et cetera, et cetera. That being said, again, it's just like you have a person who by definition, right, is actively seeking coping mechanisms, right, is actively seeking comforts, right, is actively seeking a way to get out of their pain. And then you tell them culturally and socially, then you tell them from every angle of the society, dieting will take away your pain. Once you're thin enough, you won't feel pain. You'll get everything you want. Everything in life will be fine. How could that person not become obsessed with dieting? And so it's this critical intersection between we have this sociocultural issue that, it's so easy to use as a coping mechanism. It's so easy to become obsessed with it to manage internal pain, or at least to try to get out of internal pain.
I'd like to ask you if you remember what marked the turning point for you on your path.
I will say there are multiple turning points. First of all, I would say just getting into rehab in general I can't say that wasn't a turning point because that was. My trajectory changed from I just need to succeed on this diet. I just need to try a little harder, to, oh, I need to recover. And that is a major mental shift to begin with. That being said, that mental shift did not fix me, because even when I was seeking, quote, recovery, no one was giving me proper education about how to do that. I was getting mixed messages from everyone, different therapists, different programs, different books, everyone had different things to say. And, some people are saying, oh, you're addicted to sugar, cut out sugar. Literally, especially when you're talking about binge eating, it's the wild, wild west out there. It is so poorly misunderstood. So even when I was pursuing recovery, it was chaos trying to even figure out what that meant. I wasn't getting clear direction about that. But it was still a turning point nonetheless in my thought process and my thinking process. I would say probably the most critical turning point for me was when I realized that I wasn't capable of controlling my food. But before that turning point, there was when I first discovered intuitive eating, right? Like that was a light bulb moment for sure. Again, when I first discovered intuitive eating, I still very much was engaging with diet mentality. I thought that intuitive eating would make me thin, which a lot of people do. And so I very much approached it with diet mentality and struggled with intuitive eating for years, because I didn't understand that in practicing intuitive eating or attempting intuitive eating without addressing the underlying diet mentality is useless. And then I remember having this moment after going back and forth between meal plans, intuitive eating, meal plans. I was going back and forth because, quote unquote, neither worked and I didn't know what to do. And so at some point, I just remember having this sort of like breakdown moment where I just was like, I'm not capable of controlling my food effectively. I didn't know anything about weight set point theory. I didn't know anything about health at every size. I didn't really know anything. I sort of came to this on my own. It was like the spiritual light bulb moment. It was like the clouds parted, and it became clear to me that every time I would try to control, every time I would try to resist food, whether it was trying to resist emotional eating or whether it was trying to resist a specific type of food or whatever, I remember having a moment where I realized I'm not capable of resisting food. The second I get in the ring with food, the second I try to resist, the second I'm sitting on my hands trying not to eat, it's just like a matter of time before I go on a complete rampage in my cabinets, right? I compare it to, resistance around food is like you're pulling back a bow and arrow really, really tightly. It's like the more you pull that arrow back, right, the more tension there is, the more resistance there is in the string of this bow and arrow, the further the bow is going to fly in the opposite direction the second you can't handle it anymore and let go.
Yep. The further it flies.
Right. And, another way that I often think about dieting is like hanging on by your fingernails. In dieting, I'm just saying any resistance around food for the purpose of weight control. Even when I was on the, quote, don't eat emotionally diet, which was one of the last diets I ever went on, was the don't eat emotionally diet. Every time I would want food when I, quote unquote, wasn't physically hungry or wasn't physically hungry enough or whatever, right? Or maybe I was full and I just, whenever I wanted to eat emotionally for whatever reason, I would sit on my hands being like, don't do it. It's emotional. Don't do it. It's emotional. And that mental resistance, right, literally put me right back into diet mentality. I felt like I was hanging off the side of a cliff by my fingernails, just like trying not to fall, right? And it's like, it's not sustainable. I always ended up binge eating, always, right? When I say binge eating is a reaction to restriction, people almost inevitably think that that means like physical restriction, right? Like specific, like only, exclusively, like, oh, she's starving. And, if you're starving, then yeah, at some point the hunger is going to overwhelm you and you're going to eat, right? And you're going to binge eat. And that's certainly a reality. That's certainly true. We absolutely see that all the time. But we forget that mental restriction, this restriction that comes up when we're trying not to eat, we're practicing resistance around food, even outside of physical hunger, is still resistance. It's still psychological resistance. It's still putting food on this, like, don't touch it, don't touch it, don't do it, right? It's like you're a kid in a toy store being told not to touch the toys, right? You're still in diet mentality. Food is still this like special treat. And ultimately, the point is, if you're sitting on your hands trying not to eat, you don't even need to be starving for that to be like restriction. Do you know what I mean? You don't need to be hungry for that, physically hungry for that to be a restriction. You're still using emotional and mental restraint around food, which ultimately I think pretty much always backfires.
Yeah, and it's interesting. There are so many ways in which people restrict food without even thinking about it as restriction. So for a long time,
Yeah.
I just thought that I had to eat a certain way to prove that I cared about my health, quote unquote, or
Right.
to be a sensible human being. So I was falling prey to all sorts of concepts of, quote,
Yeah.
healthy lifestyles that are
Right.
not diets, without really realizing that this was actually contributing to me feeling so crazy about this whole thing and about food, and why
Right.
I had this random binges when I wasn't overly careful all the time. So at one
Right.
stage, I realized that I was a pretty restrained eater still, and that was either being good, or when I was binging, I was bad. So
Right.
then I
Right.
learned that reintroducing those foods was the way to heal that crazy feeling. But as you might guess, the binges didn't go away. So that, as you said, brings us to the mental side of things. And
Yeah.
I think it's important to recognize if or where we are still mentally restricting. And it's not just that there is a thought that maybe I shouldn't have this, but it takes on a lot of different forms.
Yeah. I mean, basically, diet mentality is seeing the world through the lens of thin is good, fat is bad, these foods good, these foods bad, this way of eating good, this way of eating bad, right? Like basically, if you think that there is a right and a wrong way to eat, or a right way and a wrong way to have a body, you are effectively living in diet mentality, right? Mm-hmm. And the way you operate around food is going to be influenced by that, right? It's going to be affected by that. So restriction is a subtle, I always say like another way of thinking about this, and now this is just sort of linguistic semantics, but you could make the argument that binging isn't necessarily a reaction to restriction in quotes the way we normally think about it. Binging is a reaction to diet mentality as a whole, right? Thinking in this way. Because when we think about food in this way, it sort of sets us up to have a specific kind of psychological relationship with food, wherein food is this like temptress that I'm constantly trying to resist, and therefore I'm obsessed with, and blah, blah, blah. Mm-hmm. Right. So ultimately, I don't think that just giving up a physical diet, just being like, oh, I'm not going to be on Atkins anymore, I'm going to quote unquote eat what I want, that in and of itself doesn't heal binging if you're still operating under the assumption of like, oh my God, I'm eating the cupcakes, but I feel like shit about it. Clearly this is wrong. Clearly this is just going to like make me quote fat and unlovable, et cetera, right? If you still view the world through this lens of thin is good, fat is bad, this way of eating good, this way of eating bad, right? Essentially, if your food choices still dictate your self-esteem, then you are ultimately, in my opinion, still at risk of binge eating.
And also, I'm asking also if your concept of weight loss is also married to your concept of exercise.
Yeah. I mean, exercise and food, in my point of view, it's the same thing, right? Like if your relationship with exercise is such that it's about you're being a good or bad person, or you trying to control your body size, which, ultimately is, usually for people about social status, et cetera, those types of motivations are going to backfire, whether it be food, whether it be what you're eating or what you're doing with your body, right? If an action that you're taking, whether it be eating or exercise, is happening through the lens of diet mentality, right? It's happening through the lens of diet culture and diet culture beliefs, you're going to find yourself frustrated, right? And this is not the way to achieve happiness. This is ultimately going to drive you into the ground at some point.
Yeah. It's just so deep in our head, so deeply ingrained. I mean, in our daily lives, we hear about and see commercials for the quick fixes for issues with weight. We're being tempted and marketed to almost constantly. And I think this affects all people, those with bigger and those with smaller bodies. All of us think that there's something to fix, that maybe the next thing will make us part of the success circle, and we'll get to know the secret handshake of the effortlessly skinny and happy and desired people. I don't know. And it's almost as if to belong, you need to be invested in trying to lose weight. It's our culture's new religion, if you will.
Yeah.
So I think it's important to start right at the beginning, at the root of the problem. I'll do this by asking a seemingly naive question. And that is, why are people obsessed with their weight and their bodies in the first place?
There's two core reasons why anyone becomes obsessed with food in their bodies. A, they believe that becoming thin will give them social currency, social status, social value. Rainbows and unicorns will pop out of the sky. They believe that if they achieve a specific size, they will get some sort of social prize. That's number one. And number two is they believe that dieting works. They believe that there is a way to get there. They believe that they are in control of getting to that position. Both of those beliefs have to be in place in order for somebody effectively to be engaging with disordered eating, right? If you're engaging with disordered eating or even just dieting, period, Golda Paretsky recently just said, and I thought it was brilliant. She's like, there's no such thing as dieting. There's only diet binge cycling, right? Like all dieting is yo-yo dieting, basically. I think that was the exact quote. But effectively, both of those two things have to be in place in order for disordered eating to function, right? And to exist, right? Not only do you have to believe that there's a social prize at the end, you also have to believe that you're capable of achieving it, right? That you're capable, that you're going to be the 3% or whatever that maintains permanent weight loss and is able to, just get there and live the dream. Mm-hmm. Now, I would make the argument, so the vast majority of people ultimately cannot do that. We know that. Statistically speaking, most people are not capable of sticking to diets, even if you lose the weight and gain the social prize. Ultimately, it's just a matter of time, usually before you lose it. And the question is, do you want to be going up and down your whole life? Is that a way that you want to live? Or is your investment in your happiness, might that be better invested elsewhere in something more sustainable?
We need to talk about the percentage, those 3%, because when I personally started to restrict food and linking exercise to weight loss, I did manage to lose weight, and I had no idea that my years and years of weight suppression were technically a disaster waiting to happen, because I might have been one of those 3% who was successful to keep the weight down for 2 decades. But more and more over time, even though I never told anyone, I had this desolate feeling of hanging on by a thread. I was convinced that I was crazy, that something was wrong. So this quote-unquote victory ended up being so hollow, and my life got smaller and emptier and ever more dominated by rules about food and about exercise. And I was just so afraid to loosen up the reins of control. And so I think it's important to talk about those 3%, because assuming that I was one of those 3% of the entire population, I wasn't in fact one of the lucky ones, because we assume that those 3% are the lucky ones that just win at this weight loss game. But I think all of them pay an incredibly high price, sometimes even to the detriment of their health, just for their weight loss to last as long as humanly possible. And really, I wasn't for the life of me ready to stop living like a caged animal just because I had this deep diet mentality in my head and I was too afraid. I mean,
And I think that that's absolutely true. I mean, my sort of personal understanding of the science is like, it's sort of a matter of time, whether you're in the 3-year camp or the 5-year camp or the 10-year camp or 20-year camp, or maybe you die before you rebound. Maybe you die before you rebound. However, if you were in one of those camps of people who die before they rebound, meaning throughout your living life, you were quote unquote successfully restricting that whole time, what that means ultimately is that you were spending your entire life obsessed with food.
Completely,
And I think people, particularly women who struggle with diet binge cycling, which is certainly the majority, they think like once I get to the end of this next diet and lose the X number of pounds, again, unicorns and rainbows will pop out of the sky and everything will be great.
We never give up.
They don't realize that even if you're able to maintain it until you die, that means by definition that you are spending your entire life hanging off the side of a cliff by your fingernails. You just didn't happen to let go.
And we think we are in control of our weight, but in fact, we're controlled by this whole thing and our life is dominated by it. And we make this our greatest accomplishment as if it even were an accomplishment. I mean, that goes to show how much women have been taught that their self-worth is directly proportional to how much they conform to the beauty ideal du jour. This is a deeply inherently misogynistic idea. And why has this not been questioned by more women?
The reality of the situation is that most people are just trained into their personalities from birth, right? Most people are taught their beliefs, and that's that. And so, this is how internalized sexism works. This is how internalized racism works. This is how internalized oppression works, right? Is that if you're raised in a society that is sexist, homophobic, et cetera, right? Like oppressive of specific ways of life or people, groups of people, et cetera, if you're living in that situation, ultimately you believe it, or you are definitely at risk of believing it. I mean, internalized sexism, I'll just stick with sex because that's something I can speak about with some authority, right? As a woman, internalized sexism is, unless you actually challenge it, right, which usually means that somebody pointed it out to you, you just assume that that's just the way life is because that's what you've just been taught your whole life, right? And prior to somebody pointing it out to me, I would never have even thought that.
Me neither.
I would have, it has to be pointed out to you. I mean, it is not necessarily instinctive to challenge cultural norms. By definition, cultural norms are normative. So when you're raised in them, you just think it's normal.
Completely.
Right? Like, it is not instinctive to challenge cultural norms, right? Like I was making myself miserable, just to take it back to fatphobia, I was making myself sick and miserable my entire young adult life. And it never occurred to me to think of fat as a social justice issue until somebody taught me that. I think it was Virgie Tovar who first taught me that.
No wonder. Yeah.
I mean, you asked me before, what were my aha moments? I remember coming across Virgie Tovar. She had a YouTube channel at the time that she was blogging on. And I remember she had a video. This was like probably 5 years ago. She had a video called How to Overcome Internalized Fatphobia.
Yes.
And it was like my mind was blown. Like I had never thought about it that way. And I was a sociologist. I studied sociology in school. I was like boned up on sexism, boned up on sexuality issues, right? And like it had never even occurred to me to put fat into that category because no one had ever said it to me.
Talk to us about this internalized fat phobia because that's the key to our recovery.
Yeah. So, fat phobia is basically the fundamental idea that people in the society in which we live judge each other on the basis of size, right? Like that's pretty obvious. It's hard to argue that, right? Like we don't usually come out and say that out loud, but it's pretty effing obvious once you think about it. Yes, weight discrimination is real. Weight stigma is real. People do judge each other on the basis of size. If you're worried about being judged on the basis of size, you're not crazy. You're just acknowledging the culture and the population of people around you. Now, so it's pretty straightforward. Fat phobia is just literally judgment of someone on the basis of size. Internalized fat phobia is just quite simply judgment of yourself on the basis of size.
Exactly.
Fat phobia is like, oh, that person's fat, they must be lazy, right? Or they must have no willpower. Internalized fat phobia is, I'm fat, I must have no willpower.
I should be ashamed of myself.
Right. Externalized fat phobia is like, ooh, that person's fat. Ooh, not very sexy, not very attractive. Internalized fat phobia is, I'm fat. I'm not sexy. I'm not attractive.
Fat phobia is like, are you going to eat this? And internalized fat phobia is, I shouldn't have eaten this.
Exactly.
Okay.
It's exactly right. And so the reality of the situation is like when you have a specific form of bias in a particular culture, right? Fat phobia is a type of bias that we have against people with specific body types. When you have any kind of bias in a society, ultimately you're going to project those biases onto people outside of you and towards yourself. People often say to me, I only have internalized fat phobia. I don't judge other women on the basis of size. I just judge myself. And I basically always say, bullshit.
We just don't notice it right away. But if
Exactly. You don't spend hours and hours thinking about other people's bodies all day. But trust me, if you're calling yourself like lack of willpower and unattractive on the basis of size, trust me, you think that about other people too.
That's interesting. And that hits home for so many people, because that's the usual thing that nice women say when they say, oh, no, I don't judge anyone else. It's really just me. I can't let go of this diet mentality.
Right.
So I think the step towards real recovery is the key to tackle the internal diet brain.
I honestly would say, the way I describe it is, if you want to get over your food issues, you need to have body acceptance, meaning you accept that your body is what it is. You don't even have to like it in order to overcome your food issues. You just have to accept it.
And what's the difference exactly?
Okay, so acceptance basically means like, I accept that it is what it is and that this is not a situation that I am capable of controlling, right? Acceptance is like, I accept that the sky is blue, right? I don't need to like that the sky is blue to just know that that's what it is. And that's just the situation I'm in. That's the cards I was dealt. I live in a world where the sky is blue, right? Mm-hmm. My feelings about whether or not the sky is blue is irrelevant, right? Like, it doesn't matter whether or not I like the color blue or I don't like the color blue. I don't need to like or dislike to accept that that's just the reality of the situation that I'm dealing with. So acceptance is like, okay, this is my body. I'm going to let it be what it's going to be. Like, I'm going to accept it the way I accept, I was talking to a client and she was like, yeah, I accept the fact that, it's winter in Michigan right now and it's really cold. I don't need to like it to just accept it. You just accept it, you deal with it, you put on your coat and hat and you go outside and you deal with it. Ultimately, overcoming food issues is about acceptance. It's not necessarily even about liking or loving. If you can accept your body, if you can basically get to the point where you understand that fucking with your body is fruitless and useless, you're not going to struggle with food nearly as much. You don't need to like your body to overcome disordered eating necessarily, but you do have to accept it.
I see two problems on the horizon rising up. Right. And one of them is that as weight has become the social currency almost, and people are willing to give up their autonomy and their free choice with everything. I mean, the true problem nowadays is that people come out of the woodwork waving the health card. It probably still is about status, but they say, oh, you cannot gain weight. You're just going to let yourself go. So to tackle the internalized fat phobia also means to divorce the idea of weight from the idea of health, because this is something that people nowadays, especially when everybody wants to be morally righteous about their food, and this exacerbates the food problems that we have.
Yeah, ultimately, yes. And I think, again, when it comes to the acceptance conversation, which in my opinion is just sort of like the name of the game as far as not having food issues anymore. Again, overcoming fat phobia is, I think, almost, it's like, first you come to the point of acceptance, which is like sort of when you let dieting go. And then it becomes a journey of overcoming fat phobia, because ultimately living with fat phobia ruins your life, right? And it's not cool to live in a world that is fat phobic, right? Like, you start to understand, once you get to the point of acceptance, you can start to see this issue for what it is, which is a social justice issue, right? Which is a form of oppression. So one of the areas in which we're really dealing with oppression is our medical system. At some point, someone along the line sort of noticed this correlation between, specific kind of health conditions and higher body weights. And it was like the insurance companies went crazy. They were like, this is great. This is a great way to like charge more people for, and this was like way, way back in the day. I think this was like in the 60s. If anyone's interested in some of the political history of weight discrimination in our medical system, you should read a book by Glenn Gazer that I believe is called, The Obesity Myth is by Paul Campos, but just read anything by Glenn Gazer. Glenn Gazer's book. He talks about sort of the political history of how weight discrimination really came about in our medical system, and it's fascinating. But effectively, it's only in the past 100 years that people really associated fatness with poor health, and it's because, basically insurance companies saw this correlation and were like, wanted to profit off of it, quite frankly. And so then this just sort of like spiraled from there. And, now there's just like all sorts of invested interest in sort of proving that fat is bad and that dieting works, because there's a lot of money to be made in it. Fat was already starting to become unfashionable at that point. So it's like you make an issue of social oppression about health, and all of a sudden you have a politically correct way to oppress people. It's diabolical, actually.
And it's not consequential. I mean, people overwork themselves. Just different examples of how they put their health at risk, whatever they do. And none of those people are being stigmatized for overworking. None of them are being asked to pay more for their insurance. None of them are even questioned with what they do, because it is deemed good to work a lot and to work out a lot, or to need less sleep a night. And in fact, you're hurting your health just as much, but only when it comes to weight. People make this grand stigma out of that.
Right. I mean, ultimately, people think that health, quote unquote, health and quote unquote medicine is about science and science alone, and that it's this like purely evidence-based, kind of area of study. And the reality of the situation is that this idea that it's just so purely factual, purely evidence-based, and that all of the conclusions of science and medicine are just holy truth is not accurate. Right.
There is no medical evidence for diets or weight loss.
100%. But it's amazing that when you read these studies, it'll be like, yeah, so we tried this thing. We told people to go, eat only these things and work out this particular way. And, for 95% of people either dropped out of the study or gained the weight back. But you know what? Like, we're just going to rejig this concluding paragraph, and we're just gonna be like, oh, well, so apparently it doesn't matter whether or not you eat dairy or not, but just try to have an overall healthy lifestyle. Like, it's just these conclusions are just insane. It's like the study will say one thing, and then the conclusion of the study will say something completely different. I mean, it's if any of you are scientists or have research background, read some quote unquote weight loss studies
and learn to read science and studies. And how to recognize which ones are basically
bullshit.
Rigged. Yeah, because there's a sample size of 10 people, or the control group is missing, or they have only checked this for 3 months and not longer. So this all
who's funding it?
Yes,
check who's funding the study. That's a big one. Yeah.
And I was trying to make another point before, and as I had a red flag when you talked about overcoming internalized fat phobia, because I had to recently leave a group I was in on social media. In there, the question came up, can we be body positive and at the same time want to lose weight? And I only read the responses because I have my opinion on this, which is no, not really. Yeah. And then I read about 50 answers, and all of them, without exception, said, yes, of course, that is the definition of being body positive. You want it to be healthy. You want it to, you don't want it to be overweight. And yes, of course, we have to accept ourselves now. And then the goal eventually is that we control our weight. And I was outraged. I didn't even put my comment there because it was like trying to battle an army of insane people. But I really think that there's a problem right now with the term body positivity. As it's being co-opted by diet industry and everything. And there seem to be so many people out there that describe themselves as body positive people but they want to lose weight. They want to love themselves to lose weight.
Right. Yeah, the love yourself to lose weight diet. My favorite diet to make fun of.
Go ahead.
I mean, the love yourself to lose weight diet is such a crock of shit. And I think it's one of the most dangerous diets out there. Although, it's weird. Like, it was the last diet I ever went on. And quite frankly, there is a part of me that sometimes wonders if I would ever have even started to work on body image if I didn't think that maybe it would help me lose weight, right?
I see.
I think the love yourself to lose weight diet is often the last diet that people go on, right? Like, I think that, and so part of me wants to just like completely just criticize it so boldly and brashly because it feels like such a slap in the face for real body positive activists who ultimately the history of body positivity, right? The word body positivity comes out of an understanding that diets don't work. And that's the historical context of the term body positive. You know, the term body positive was first described by activists who effectively were saying, hey, we don't have any reason to believe that dieting actually works or that I actually can make my body look a certain way through force. That's the history of the term body positivity. So anyone who, you know, I love this on the internet, you know, people just throw around words however they want to use them. They steal words, they steal language, and they just reappropriate them, refurbish them, use them however they want to use them. And it's like, actually, this word was defined by somebody. It was created by somebody who intended it to be used in a particular way. And you're just deciding to steal it and use it in a completely different way. And you just think that you have the right to redefine the term body positivity. You do not have the right to redefine body positivity. The question, how do we define body positivity, should not necessarily be a community-based answer. The term body positivity has a history. It actually means something specific. Yes. But anyway, I'm going to stop ranting.
It's just so sad that people are being infected by this. As in those experiments where they check to see what happens in groups when, like, say, two people look up into the sky, and then how all of a sudden everybody stares up into the sky. And it's the same with all those definitions and new lifestyle programs and the new definition of body positivity being a motivation to lose weight. And suddenly everybody gets sucked in that direction. And that's why I want to make a point of this. Because that's not what this is about.
Yeah. So there's a part of me that gets like up in arms and totally freaks out about this and is just like so, you know, miserable and angered by this sort of reappropriation of the term and just the love yourself to lose weight diet, right? That being said, I look back on my personal history and I will say, I sometimes wonder how long it would have taken me to get into body positivity. I wonder if I ever even, maybe I would never even gotten there if I wasn't on the love yourself to lose weight diet first. I don't know. Because I remember that when I was dieting and when I was trying to quote unquote overcome emotional eating and binge eating, I was not interested in body image work. I thought that was giving up and that was just going to make me fat and unlovable, in quotes, right? And I wanted nothing to do with body image work when I was, you know, emotional eating and binge eating. And when that was how I identified myself, you know, back in the day, I identified myself as a quote emotional eater, as a quote binge eater. And in that place, I wanted nothing to do with body image. I just assumed if I overcome this issue, I'll be thin and I won't need to work on loving my body because I'll be thin. And so that was obviously just misinformation. I think the most important thing is that people get the information they need, which is that is just not factually accurate, right? That body diversity is real, that under healthful circumstances, people are going to be all sorts of different sizes, right? Not binge eating, not emotional eating, you know, whatever, quote unquote, healing your relationship with food does not mean acquiring a specific body size. But I found body positivity ultimately through that. It was like, I was willing to get on the body image work train when I thought that it would make me thinner. And then over time, I eventually realized, and then I got the information and then I read Health at Every Size and then everything sort of clicked and I was like, oh yeah, I get it. That's bullshit. Actually, your body just is what it is.
What could really help people at this point is maybe you elaborating on your brilliant quote that says, obsession with weight doesn't happen in a vacuum. So please share what you mean by it.
Yes, usually I'll say wanting to lose weight doesn't happen in a vacuum, right? Like people just say, oh, I want to lose weight. And I'll be like, why? And they're shocked. They're like, what do you mean, why? I want to lose weight. Everyone wants to lose weight.
And they say, because I want to be healthy.
Yeah, right, which is bullshit 95% of the time. I'm like, really? Just because you want to be healthy? I'm like, why don't you try sleeping more and like drinking less? I mean, ultimately, that's almost a cover-up when they say that. But most people will admit that it's not just about health.
No, it's about happiness or something.
Yeah, most people will admit that. There's occasionally I'll meet somebody who's like, this is 100% just about health. I really don't care what I look like to other people. And those people usually, if they're being honest, are actually easier to deal with. Because then it's like, oh, really? It's just about health? God, let me just teach you the science and then you're good to go. You know, like, let me just show you some new science that you're clearly not aware of, and then we're fine. And then this conversation is over. Whereas people who, you know, For the vast majority of people where social status is a part of this conversation, right, and lovability and fitting in and acceptance, et cetera, is part of this conversation. First of all, when I ask them the conversation, why do you want to lose weight? It takes them a minute to even verbalize why they want to lose weight specifically, right? And so, wanting to lose weight, obsessing about food doesn't happen in a vacuum, right? What that really means is that people don't just want to lose weight. They want to lose weight because of what they think weight loss will bring them. When people say, I want to lose weight, what they're really saying is, I want to be loved.
Yes.
What they're really saying is, I want to be accepted. What they're really saying is, I want to have a big, full, rich life. And I've been told my entire existence that the only way to achieve that is through getting a certain body size. That's what people are really saying when they say, I want to lose weight. And so, so my sort of take on that is that, remember, like, no one wants to lose weight in a vacuum. If diet mentality comes up, right, there's some greater social reason for that.
I love that. It really helps me to just remind myself, like, you wouldn't do this if you were alone here. You would just enjoy your body, your vessel. And that it really breaks it down into more digestible pieces where you can go and explore your own thinking better, because it really stops the entire inner gremlin stream of negative thoughts and negative self-talk and everything. So thank you for bringing that up. And most people these days, as you did, identify themselves either as binge eaters or emotional eaters, or as being, I'm addicted to sugar, I'm addicted to bread, I can't eat this, I have a chemical reaction to this food and that food. Yeah. So please go into why that is so problematic.
The addiction conversation is a complex one that I love to speak about with people in dialogue format, because, I find that when people say I'm addicted to food, they say that like it's a fact. Like I got 2 emails recently, from people basically fundamentally saying the same thing, saying, I love what you do. I love what you're saying. It all makes sense to me. But what do you do about the actual, quote, chemical addiction that sugar creates? Mm-hmm. And, what's your response to that? What do we do about that? Ooh. And, and as people throw around this word addiction, like it is, again, it's sort of like how people think about like everything science says is the holy grail. It's like, so addiction, the term addiction itself was socially constructed by effectively psychologists. And it can be a very useful term in helping people understand their experiences of what they're dealing with. That being said, when we apply it to food specifically, the first thing I'll say to people when they say to me, what do we do about the fact that sugar is addictive? The first thing I say to them, so what specifically do you mean by addictive? Like, let's get specific. Instead of just throwing around the term addiction really loosely, actually tell me, like, what do you mean by the term addiction when it comes to sugar? There are studies that say that sugar is addictive because when we eat sugar, pleasure centers in our brain light up. Okay.
They do that when we hug other people too.
Right. Exactly. It's like you have to get into the minutia of which definition of addiction you're actually using in order to have a debate about it. One of the most common ones, actually, which in my opinion is really interesting that it's one of the most common ones because it's also the easiest to dispute, is this idea of like, research studies show that when you eat sugar, it lights up pleasure centers in your brain. So that means it's addictive. Right. And my argument to that is exactly what you just said. Oh, really? Something causing pleasure makes it inherently addictive? Like it makes you inherently feel out of control around it? What about sex? Do you have a healthful relationship with sex? Do you have a healthful relationship with music, hugs, all of these things, right? So people call anything addictive if they're using it as a coping mechanism. Mm-hmm. I think we need to get really clear about exactly what we mean when we say I'm addicted to food. Like, what does that mean? Does that mean you're eating emotionally? Does that mean you're using food to soothe your feelings? Does that mean that simply you just feel out of control around food? Most people, I would say, when they throw around the term food addictions, if they're referencing a research study, it's almost always the pleasure centers one. If they're just describing their experience, right? So I used to call myself a food addict. And when I used to call myself a food addict, really all I was saying was I feel out of control around certain foods. And that's a very specific definition of the word addiction, right? That we really need to look into, because if you're calling yourself a food addict just because you feel out of control around specific foods, that doesn't inherently imply some sort of chemical reaction happening in your body that triggers this out of control feeling, we have to actually ask ourselves the question, well, so why do you feel out of control around these foods? 9 times out of 10, I would make the argument that if someone feels violently out of control around a specific food, it's because they're restricting it.
Yes. How genius. No one thinks about it like that. Yeah.
Yes. I really encourage people, when it comes to food, it's like, don't just say to me, well, what about the fact that I'm a food addict? Be specific. What are you actually saying? What do you actually mean by that? Because depending on what you mean, I'm going to have a different answer to that question.
And what's the problem with the term being an emotional eater? Because all I hear is people saying, I'm a binge eater. I'm an emotional eater. I shouldn't eat emotionally. I shouldn't binge eat.
Right. Well, emotional eating, when people say I'm an emotional eater, they are usually saying it as a bad thing, right? Like, it's like when people say I'm so fat, they're usually saying it as a bad thing. There are people in the world who say it as a neutral thing. Just say it just like, oh yeah, it's just a descriptor. Like, I'm tall, I have blue eyes, and I'm fat, right? And that's awesome. I wish we used the term emotional eating similarly. I wish we just used it as a neutral descriptor of a relatively benign coping mechanism. But unfortunately, that's not how people use it, right? Emotional eating, it's just like something that happens. It's like, oh, I'm just using food as a coping mechanism, just like I might use a million other things as a coping mechanism. On the spectrum of coping mechanisms, emotional eating is not that big of a deal. Like, it's not heroin, guys. Like, there are way worse ways that you could be dealing with your feelings, right? That being said, usually when people use the term emotional eating, they highly villainize the term. The reality of the situation is that emotional eating is a real thing. People do use food like they use sex and all sorts of other pleasurable things in their lives to manage feelings sometimes, right? I mean, when we're feeling sad, we might try to get some pleasure. That might be something that happens. And when we villainize that, when we make that wrong, all we do is send ourselves into the Last Supper mentality, into diet mentality, into all of these things, which ultimately is what leads to binge eating, right? And binge eating ultimately is defined as a reaction to diet mentality, right? Like, I hate when people throw around the term binge eating because they quote unquote ate too much. It's like, no, that's not how we're using the term binge eating anymore. Binge eating is a reaction to deprivation. It could be a spoonful of peanut butter, it could be 100 pints of ice cream. It's just a reaction to diet mentality. Stop defining binge eating based on the volume of food that you're eating. All that is a judgment. If you use the term binge eating to describe like you eating quote unquote too much, all that you're doing is participating in diet mentality by using binge eating that way.
All you're making it worse.
Yeah. You're just participating in a judgment of your food. It's like, oh, I crossed this line that I made up in my head where I've decided that this is too much. This is too much. This is too much food. It's a binge, right? Right? It's like, at what point does it become a binge? The point that you decide that it's worth judging yourself and making yourself feel badly about it? We need to stop using binge eating in that way. And I would make the argument that reacting to diet mentality isn't even necessarily a bad thing. The binge eating isn't the problem. The restriction is the problem. Binge eating, like I said earlier in this interview, is ultimately a natural, you could even make the argument, healthy reaction to restriction.
I'd like to ask an almost naive question now. Why is not dieting so hard? How do you help people get out of their diet mentality brain?
This is sort of harkening back to previous point in the interview. One, people diet because they think it works, and people diet because they think that there's a prize at the end. And as sort of like a caveat to that, or as an addition to that, to what we were saying before, if for some reason it is, quote, working for them, like they are successfully restraining their weight, they also somehow think that it's worth it, right? So it's like, you have to believe that it works. You have to think that dieting is worth it. You have to think that you're going to get the social prize at the end, and you have to think that the social prize is worth the misery of dieting. Those three things have to be in place in order for this cycle to continue. I would say you can break the cycle ultimately at any of those three places, because if any of those three pillars fail, you wouldn't do it anymore, right? If it wasn't worth it, you wouldn't do it. If there was no social prize, you wouldn't do it. And if you didn't think it worked, you wouldn't do it. One of those three pillars has to break in order for people to stop dieting. Does that make sense?
Yeah, that was really helpful. It's like a three-legged stool.
Yeah. Exactly.
Perfect. Thanks for repeating.
Yeah. Cool.
You're on this program called Stop Fighting Food. It's sort of become your flagship, and you're well known for it. Can you describe what this program entails?
Yeah, so Stop Fighting Food, it's a quick free video training series that I offer to the public that's just sort of an introduction to my work. That's how usually people find me, is that they show up at stopfightingfood.com. They may also show up at my website. I have a blog that I've been writing for a long time that also, gets a fair amount of traffic. But the vast majority of people who find me on stopfightingfood.com. They find my video training series, they sign up for my video training series, and they watch these sort of 3 introductory videos to my work. And then people will, from that point on, will get weekly free coaching emails from me. And that's usually how I develop relationships with humans, with people. That's, sort of where my quote unquote audience is. I'm not really on social media. I don't participate in a lot of social media. How I teach is pretty much primarily through videos and writing. And then once or twice a year, I run a masterclass, which is an intensive 4-month group coaching program where we really, really get into the weeds of everything that we've been talking about on this call. It is like the ultimate boot camp in changing your relationship with food, in my opinion. And that program has been, very successful and done incredibly well. I would say the Stop Fighting Food Masterclass, that program that happens once a year, is sort of my baby. That's the primary way that people work with me. And that's the ultimate educational program that I provide.
So you go into the political side of things, the diet culture side of things, and feminism and women's oppression, everything.
All of it. Yep, all of it. It literally starts with intuitive eating and it goes to weight as a social issue.
Awesome. And what's up with this movie called Fatitude? I've not heard of it again. I only know that you've been part of it, but not been released or anything. So I was just
It's not been released. They're still in post-production, so the movie hasn't come out yet, but you can find the trailer online, and it is a documentary about weight stigma, and about weight discrimination. Because again, most people don't even think of this issue as an issue of a discrimination or as an issue, a stigma issue or an issue of oppression. Most people have never thought about it that way, right? So this documentary is really sort of presenting weight as a social issue to the world, which I'm incredibly excited about. The 2 women who are making it are absolutely excellent. And so Fatitude, I don't have all the details. I mean, I'm not super involved in the production, but I was interviewed for it, and I'm very, very personally excited for this movie to come out. I mean, the list of interviewees that they have is just incredible. And I have a feeling that this is going to be a really pivotal movie in sort of the history of our social understanding of this issue. I mean, this is the first movie like this that I have ever known to come out. There's another one that's out actually right now, the Embrace documentary, that I have not seen, so I can't speak to it. Although it seems like Fatitude is going to be very different than that.
I can't wait. Maybe 2017, who knows?
Yeah, fingers crossed. We'll see.
Yeah.
But thank you so much for having me on the show.
Oh, you're welcome. And I have the final question for you. What would you like to be remembered for?
Oh, wow. I mean, I would like to be remembered for changing the way people think about this issue. I mean, that's really all I want to do. I mean, that's my mission every day. I mean, I think the one thing I really like about my work is that by definition, I'm working with people who are struggling to understand this stuff. And I feel like it's an incredibly important responsibility and something I take really seriously, to be in a position where I'm actually explaining things from the bottom up and really able to help people understand the true roots of this issue and help them really think about this issue in a different way.
Thank you so much for sharing all these great insights with us. It's really made a difference. I wish you a good rest of the day.
You too. Have a wonderful day, Merritt. Talk to you soon.
This was today's dose of badassery from Life Unrestricted. Find the show notes with links to everything we mentioned in this episode over at lifeunrestricted.org. And if this show is making you feel good, awesome, make sure to subscribe and please let others feel good too. By leaving a 5-star review on iTunes, you'll help make this show more visible and therefore more accessible for others. You're the best. Thanks.